Hey everyone, thanks for joining me again in MasterQuest. I must have some subconscious desire to keep talking about Radiata stories because the title of this video's game sounds eerily similar to it. Today, I want to shed some light on a little gem known as Radiant Historia. Now, this game was originally co-developed by Atlas and Headlock on the DS. No joke though, literally while writing the script in fact, I discovered that Radiant Historia was developed by a team comprised of Atlas's Shin Megami Tensei series, which I do enjoy a lot, and, get this, for those of you that watched my previous video, some of the Tri-Ace team that developed Radiata stories. Guess my instincts were right on the mark after all. Not only that, I had this uncanny feeling about the game's music. It sounded incredibly familiar to Kingdom Hearts, and lo and behold, there's a reason for that too, as the legendary Yoko Shimomura also worked on the soundtrack. So I'd always loved this game after being referred to it many years back, but am just now connecting all of these dots on aspects that I enjoy from elsewhere. It's good to know this game had such a strong background, and, if nothing else, hopefully seeing such prevalent names present in the game's creation will spur you to try it out yourself if you haven't already done so. Background aside, what is Radiant Historia? Well, simply put, it's a JRPG in which the story follows the protagonist, Stock, who I constantly wrote down as Locke and will probably mess up at least once, through his adventures on the continent of Vancouver. Stock is a special agent for the country of Alistel and specializes in undercover work typical of the field. Assassinations, espionage, you name it. Alistel is currently at war with the rival kingdom Granorg, as the continent is essentially turning to sand in a process called desertification, which is also a real-life issue, take care of your trees. Right off the bat, there's a multi-layered threat of both winning an immediate war and resolving an environmental crisis. In the game's opening moments, Stock is handed a book called the White Chronicle by his superior and sent out on an extremely dangerous mission. He's provided two subordinates named Rainey and Marco to assist him, but shortly after meeting them for the first time and giving them their orders, Stock has a premonition of the two of them dying in battle. This is reinforced by his best friend Rosh warning him not to go on this mission as he has a feeling something bad is going to happen. Though being the consummate professional he is, Stock leaves anyway. Turns out everyone, including Stock himself, was right. Rainey and Marco are killed and Stock is critically injured, throwing himself into a nearby river to escape his attackers. It's then that the White Chronicle begins to glow and Stock is transported to the world of Historia, a realm outside of time. The two guardians inside the book, Lipti and Tio, tell Stock that the book's true owner can travel back and forth through time using the White Chronicle's power. However, this power has a few very specific rules. First, the user can only travel back and forth between specific moments that are pivotal to history, known as nodes. Second, the user's time is separate from the world's time. Basically, anything that happens to the wielder will persist no matter where they go in time, evidenced by Stock retaining his injuries from the opening mission, while still managing to go back in time to rescue Rainey and Marco. Third, the user can only travel to nodes that they themselves are present for. It's basically a tool used to rewrite one's own mark on history. Now, Stock is understandably skeptical about this fantastic power, but the Guardians are unable to disclose any answers to his questions of why and how, stating that this is to protect him. Pushing through his hesitation, he is successfully able to turn back time and rewrite the outcome of the opening mission, saving Rainey and Marco in the process and setting the stage for the game's events. The next major event is one that prompts Stock with a critical decision that essentially diverges history into two distinct paths, standard history and alternate history. From here on, Stock not only travels back and forth through time, he travels across both timelines in his quest to save the future. The best way to visualize this is essentially that Stock is living two lives at the same time. The events in both timelines still transpire, but the outcome is different depending on where Stock is at the time. For instance, one timeline has Stock infiltrating Granorg from the inside, while the other sees Stock joining the beast tribes in the southern region of Celestia. While there is some overlap in the areas that Stock travels between, especially early on, I never actually found it too tedious to trek through an area in the other timeline. Usually there's a barricade or issue present on one side that isn't present in the other. As the game goes on, the two timelines stray further and further away from each other until eventually the player is undergoing entirely separate storylines with different party members and different scenarios. The two timelines are connected as well. While Stock's condition persists no matter what, changes made in one timeline subtly affect the other. For instance, saving a merchant from bandits in one timeline allows that same merchant to reach their destination in the other. This makes more sense when it's revealed that these issues are stemmed from an evil influence, subtly distorting the events of history. Since this outside influence is mucking things up, time can only proceed normally with Stock making things right again. While I don't want to give away too much of the story, since, in my opinion, the story is the biggest highlight of the game, I think the game has a satisfying story loop in encountering situations that require this time hopping to solve. Especially towards the end of the game, where the player needs to hop through a bunch of nodes simultaneously in order to make a series of small changes that gradually grow into one major change. Fortunately, the game has a story tab that can always be accessed, which shows each storyline and each branching path. One thing about this that I'm not so keen on though is the handful of broken endings. Basically, multiple times the game will prompt stock with a major decision, but unlike the first major decision, which splits the game into two storylines, these ones only have a single possible option to proceed. Selecting the wrong option leads to a broken outcome, where history is immediately doomed and the player gets a game over. It is an interesting concept, and it does require that the player puts some thought into their actions, as the correct option is almost always the smarter option of the two, being the one that makes the most sense in this situation. I'm just not sure there's a better way to execute something like that. It's cool from a storytelling point of view, don't get me wrong, but from a gameplay standpoint, it's a bit of a pace breaker. Thankfully, though, the game always provides a save point close to, if not right next to, the decision, usually presented directly by an NPC, and you pretty much always have some headway about an important decision that's about to happen, so it's rarely a surprise. And even though I'm not a fan of the actual gameplay implications, I do think that some of those broken endings have some really interesting character implications, especially regarding Stock himself. Now, for a game about history, this game fittingly has a lot of story to fill in the pages, but Stock & Co. aren't able to resolve every situation with diplomacy. There's a lot of battles to be had in this history, and from my experience, Radiant Historia has a very unique battle system. Battles are turn-based, and take place with enemies on a 3x3 grid. You can see each action that's upcoming, the next 10 turns for allies and enemies alike. The closer to the party enemies are, in relation to the grid that is, the more damage they both deal and receive. Enemies can move around between points on the grid, and there are larger enemies that take up multiple spaces, sometimes even the entire grid. While the grid style itself is pretty unique, the real secret spice to this gameplay is utilizing skills to move enemies around. Stock & Co. have abilities that can push or pull enemies in different directions. If you push an enemy into a space occupied by another enemy, any attacks that land afterwards stack and hit both enemies at the same time. On top of this, the game has a combo system wherein the more subsequent hits, not just attacks mind you, but individual hits, you land on enemies, the more damage each cumulative attack will do. If an enemy turn comes up while they're stacked together, all the enemies will separate into adjacent tiles, so the best results coming from having a bunch of ally turns in a row. The final ingredient in this battle system is the change mechanic, which allows the currently active ally to swap out a turn with anyone else in the turn order, including enemies. Changing turns puts the ally in a state called Baroque mode, where they turn red and take increased damage from attacks, so you don't want to use the ability recklessly, but by making smart changes you can align your party just right to chain big attacks together. Your combo counter contributes to bonus experience after the battle too, and the damage can really climb up with those stacked modifiers, so there's a good incentive for players to master the unique gimmicks of the system. All party members also eventually get access to a Monoburst, which at first will allow them simply to remove an enemy turn panel, but as you progress in the story, will eventually add powerful techniques to each member's arsenal. Changing turns with enemies will cause that enemy to immediately attack. Enemies have a wide range of techniques, and in some cases will even line up with each other to create a formation that allows them to unleash power attacks. Due to this battle system, skills that hit multiple enemies, or heal multiple allies, are few and far between, so the game will really test your strategic skills. Most bosses follow the same formula as enemy encounters, and usually have helper adds with them too, so getting familiar with moving enemies around the battlefield is the quickest way to success. The only exception is the Hell Spider. All my homies hate the Hell Spider. Which leads me to my next point. This game is hard. Encounters in the game aren't random, and enemies are found roaming freely in the overworld. You can smack them with your sword, but there's only a chance you'll stun them. Entering battles, especially later in the game, will find you taking a hit from practically every enemy before you even get a chance to act. And if you get hit in the back on the overworld, ooh, yeesh. I mean, look at the surprise attack here. The enemy had 14 turns before I had a single one. At least escaping becomes easy pretty fast. I'm not really sure what formula goes into escaping battles, but after the first couple hours it ends up being incredibly lenient, even to the point where I was escaping almost immediately every time. That's just encountering the battles though. The enemies themselves hit like trucks. This game has no difficulty settings that I could find, and the default difficulty is brutal. There were plenty of times where I was barely hanging on, or was only able to beat a boss with clever item usage and a lot of patience. I felt overleveled, but also very underleveled. I mean, check out this fight where the boss had 2 attacks in a row and just decided to use the AoE for both, basically killing me instantly, and there was nothing I could have done there. I think this game fell into older trappings of relying on heavy grinding in order to proceed further in the game. And the main issue I found was keeping up with the damage output. Like I mentioned before, party healing is limited, and even a strong spell like Greater Area Heal just doesn't keep up with the output. And bosses are so fast that even if you use multiple turns to heal up, the boss will just rip you a new one on their next turn anyway, and you'll eventually lose the attrition war. I think this game wanted to emphasize healing items or something, as I ended up stocking up on healing fruits, which give a flat 300 HP to all party members. Unfortunately, only one merchant in the game sells them, maybe 2, but only one that I could reasonably access, and it's not a merchant near the end of the game either. Well, the rest of the game rounds out with stock running around a decent-sized overworld. There's a handful of different towns and locations, though generally only a small portion of the world is open at any one time in the story. The smaller sub-areas are connected via a large overworld map that clears out as you progress through the story. Some areas, like the Grand Plain, are large and have multiple zones in them with unique corresponding nodes on the overworld map. Speaking of maps, I found myself actually wishing I had one. The game was a DS title, and there's 2 screens, and the top screen has a space for party status and also lists the location name, but then there's this open grid-like space that really could have used a map, but didn't for some reason. Some of the areas can be really confusing, and the lack of map made navigation difficult, especially since leaving each sub-zone causes every enemy in the area to respawn, and those battles could get rough. Aside from just running around, Stock can also move objects like crates and barrels, and eventually he'll be able to blow up the barrels to destroy enemies and obstacles. Later on, he'll round out his skill set with the ability to see hidden treasures, which will automatically pop into place when he gets close. While getting the skill and using it the first time is a little tedious, it ends up being a really neat mechanic that encourages exploration and makes even those really obscure dead ends feel like a reward whenever you walk up to the end and a chest pops out. Overall, there's a decent balance of location variety, with lush tropical jungles, large sandy deserts, and dark foreboding ruins. One nice thing is that you'll almost always have a town or rest point available. While you can restore your party's HP and MP at save points, you have to use mana crystals to do so. These are limited consumables that cost a whopping 5,000 gold a pop. Often they're useful for convenience, but I really only needed to resort to them once or twice. You can always just travel to a different node in time to access an inn if absolutely necessary, though be mindful that if you haven't reached the next node in your current time, you might have to replay some sections over again. I made that mistake myself when I dropped from a stopping point in the story to do a side quest without realizing that stopping point didn't have a node, and there was a lengthy gameplay segment leading up to it. I just reset the game and did the side quest afterwards. Speaking of side quests, there's actually a good handful of them around the game, and they give pretty good rewards, from equipment to technique scrolls. The technique scrolls were an interesting choice for gameplay. Each character has 4 of them hidden around the world somewhere, either findable in the world itself or as rewards for subquests, and they teach incredibly useful, unique skills to party members, but they can only be taught by a specific NPC. 3 different NPCs for certain party members, in fact. The issue here is that there's no in-game hint at what any of these things even are. The first NPC who teaches you about the scrolls is in a side room at the beginning of the game at the major choice node and is only available here. You can always come back to this node and talk to him, but if you don't know he's there, you'd miss out on these techniques throughout most of the game. Like I did. Like I've done multiple times. The other 2 NPCs are similar, with both being missable NPCs that are only available during a specific point in the game. One NPC teaches 3 party member skills, including stock, but is literally found by initiating a subquest at the bottom of a random well in the desert. The game really rewards exploration, but this is a little too obscure for my taste, especially when the level up time between skills can be pretty far, and the difference those unique skills can make is pretty big. All in all though, the game is solid, with an engaging story, and makes for an enjoyable experience despite its flaws. But if you're anything like me, you might be wondering about some of these things like the lack of map or difficulty issues. Well, it's been my experience that people at least recognize Radiant Historia somewhere. The version of the game I've been talking about was the original version of the game, but the version people generally recognize or remember is the enhanced 3DS version known as Radiant Historia Perfect Chronology. Now this is a definitive version right here. The game got a pretty extensive overhaul and actually is the first version I played. The standard remake editions apply. Graphical overhaul, updated character designs, and improved audio is there and accounted for. But start a new game and the new changes are already front and center. Upon hitting the title screen, the title is narrated by multiple characters.
Radiant Historia Perfect Chronology.
The Perfect Chronology version has full voice acting for all major characters and many voice clips for minor characters like enemies as well. The voice acting is pretty solid too. The original game already had a pretty well written script that was clean and well adjusted to English speaking audiences, but they went one step further by having the lines be read out loud. The voice actors have pretty extensive histories too, with Stock being voiced by Xander Mobus, known for the voice of Ren from Persona 5, and Benjamin Diskin, who I didn't know by name before this, but is the voice of young Master Xehanort from Kingdom Hearts 3 and Caspar from Fire Emblem Three Houses. He has a very distinct voice that you'd recognize. The characters also got updated in-game mugs with multiple new expressions to match the tone of the dialogue. Overall, the presentation is just cleaner. I mean, take a look at Rosh's mug in both versions and see how there's almost like a Photoshop-y type clip in the original game's portrait. That said, I'm actually not a fan of all of the redesigns. Most of the characters look fine, and I like Stock's side profile and conversation as it better fits his initially aloof character, but honestly, I wasn't a fan of Rainie's redesign that kinda homogenized her face and made her a little bit more feminine in design. And I could say the same for Erica too, who was almost completely redesigned. I felt like her original design was a much better interpretation of her character and who she was, and is very stylized, but apparently she was intended to have long hair and a softer design to fit her nobility aesthetic. Her in-game sprite, though, is way better, no matter which way you look at it, especially in battle. Like, what did they do to her eyes? There were a large number of quality of life changes too. Adding a map to the top screen, for example. Seriously, there was just an open spot before, how did they miss that? Voice acting in battle. Selectable difficulties, including a friendly mode that players can use to trivialize the combat and defeat enemies instantly on the field, as well as mission indicators above NPC heads, so you know who gives out a side quest and who else is important to said quest, and lastly, a support skill system based on Tokyo Mirage sessions that lets party members finish a combo with an automatic skill finisher. Battles flow a lot better, and I think enemy speed was adjusted, as in the original game, even being over-leveled and having this rare +5 speed accessory equipped, initiating a fight, that is, not being ambushed but just initiating a fight, the entire enemy team would get to attack first. At least in the normal difficulty, it seems a lot better balanced in turn order. Also, striking enemies with your sword is now guaranteed to knock them out, where it wouldn't always work in the original. That said, the single biggest and most important change is the addition to the story. Perfect Chronology adds an entirely extra layer of story to the base games, culminating in a new, complete, alternate ending. What was so impressive to me is that many times when a game is remade, new content is usually either stuffed at the end or given like a mission key or something. Like you get a side quest that just accesses the different content. The new stuff always feels separate, but not in Perfect Chronology. The new content is actually weaved into the story itself. Not only that, but the devs took the time to design the game both ways with a mode selection when you create a new game. If you've never played the base game before, you can experience it as intended with Append mode, where all of the new content created for the remake takes place after the main story is concluded. If you have played the base game, or you just want the most immersive full experience, you can select Perfect mode, which integrates the new content into the story. Yeah. Think about that. My run-through of the base game for recording was around 28 hours. Plenty of that was not optimal play, and I would leave the game running here and there while I ran an errand, but that's still roughly 25 hours for a casual run-through of the game, which is pretty long for a DS game, mind you. The devs went and integrated a brand new storyline with multiple additional branching paths into that 25-hour campaign, meaning as you play the game, you organically encounter bits and pieces of the new story content as if it was already part of the game itself. That's just so damn cool. That's the level of content dedication I think we look for in remakes of our popular games, and really is kind of the spirit of Master Quest in general. Giving players a new spin on an experience they enjoyed, and taking the time and care to make it feel like part of the experience, not just slapped in afterwards. I wanted to add a couple of funny things I noticed that I wasn't really sure where to fit in elsewhere in the video. It's not much of a spoiler considering you don't have any context on what's going on, but you can definitely tell Radiant Historia is an Atlas game. Look at this boss and tell me this isn't just a Mementos prototype from Persona. Also, in the Perfect Chronology remake, the new NPC has a book of her own, mirroring Stock's and a certain other characters. Hers is specifically a red one. A JRPG with a strong theme of heading towards an apocalyptic future where there are 3 extremely powerful tomes, a white one, a black one, and a red one. I wonder if there's a correlation there. Anyway. If you want a good quality JRPG to sink your teeth into, Radiant Historia is a good fit. Battles are frenetic and engaging, landing those big hit counts feels damn good, the story is unique and fun to explore, and everything feels really cohesive and put together. There's a lot of good themes and questions being asked, and while some of the party members aren't super complex or deep per se, they're all unique and well written. I would absolutely avoid the base game. As with the Perfect Chronology version, there's no reason to play it over the other one unless you just want to experience the original game. I can safely say that after playing the original, I have a much greater admiration for how much Perfect Chronology added to the formula, and there's so much extra story content at the end that the base game story resolution feels pretty unsatisfying afterwards. Like I said before, if nothing else, I hope that the tenure of the teams involved convinces you to try out the game for yourself if it sounds interesting. After revisiting it myself after so long, I had forgotten most of the game and ended up finding myself fully engaged with it, even the really frustrating base game. Perfect Chronology isn't a perfect game per se, but in my opinion it is a perfect remake, or at least the Master Quest standard that remakes should adhere to. Anyway, thanks for checking out this video and for showing your support as the channel grows. As always, please do the YouTube usual and let me know what you think. I've already got my next video planned covering another game that hits a little closer to home. I hope you check that one out when it drops. I've got a link here to my Yada Yada Stories video and my other sub-series Second Quest if you want to check those out too. Thanks again for dropping by and see you soon.